So you want to know how your nervous system works? Well then this video is for you. If you're new to the channel, my name is Nigel and I graduated with a 99.05 ATAR and received subject prizes across biology and chemistry subjects. And it's my pleasure to bring you the video for this week. So without further ado, let's get into it. So before we get into all the complex details about the nervous system, do you even know what the nervous system is? The nervous system is a series of cells called neurons which communicate messages all across the body using electrical impulses. You need to know that the nervous system can be divided into two different components: the central nervous system, which is the spine and the brain, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everywhere else. Within the system, there are several nerve pathways which extend to different areas of the body. But what does a nerve pathway look like? Well, it looks something like this. I know, it looks very complicated at first, but we're going to break down each section of it, and then we're going to come back to this image and you're going to feel like a genius because you know everything about it. So the first component of the nerve pathway are the sensory neurons. These are the neurons which take the electrical impulse from the receptors and transmits them towards the central nervous system. Although these neurons are microscopic, the diagram on the screen is a pretty accurate depiction of what they look like. So let's have a go at labeling some of these parts. First up, we have the dendrites. These are the little branches which are next to the receptor cell which pick up the electrical impulses. Then as we look down the neuron, we can see that it's covered in these sausage-like casings. These are called the myelin sheaths. The myelin sheath's role is to make sure the electrical impulse flows a lot faster. So underneath the myelin sheath, we have the axon. The axon is this long extension of the neuron and is the main pathway for the electrical impulse to travel through. As we move to the middle of the neuron, you can see here we have the cell body. The cell body is basically the whole brain of the neuron. It controls the operations and functions of the neuron. Then as we get to the end of the neuron, you get these little branches which we call presynaptic terminals. These branches are responsible for transmitting the electrical impulse to the next neuron. And the next neuron we're going to look at is the interneuron. The role of interneurons is to send the electrical impulse between each other along the spine and the brain before sending the signal to the motor neuron. If we have a look at the diagram of the interneurons, we can see that it has very similar components to that of the sensory neurons, except with the interneurons there are no myelin sheaths covering the axon, and the cell body can either be in the middle of the neuron or towards the dendrites. Once the electrical impulse reaches the brain and gets processed, the interneurons then transmit the signal to the motor neurons. The motor neuron is responsible for sending electrical impulses to the effector cells, which then trigger the appropriate biological response. Again, we can see that it has very similar components to the sensory neuron, except this time the cell body must be towards the start of the neuron where the dendrites are. Now throughout this explanation I've used the words such as receptors and effectors, and I've actually made another video on them, so why don't you go check that out as soon as you're done with this video. So now let's look at the image I showed you at the beginning of the video with the whole nerve pathway, and we're going to briefly run through it. So the nerve pathway begins with the receptor cell sending an electrical impulse to the sensory neuron. The electrical impulse then flows through the sensory neuron and gets transmitted to the interneurons, which are in the central nervous system. The electrical impulse is then sent between many different interneurons before getting transmitted to a motor neuron and then getting transmitted to the effectors to bring about the appropriate biological response. Keep in mind when you're drawing this diagram and you're putting all the different neurons together in this order, you need to make sure that the electrical impulse always flows from the dendrites to the presynaptic terminals. The order of that is very important. So now we're going to talk about reflex responses. Reflex responses are involuntary actions that we do that aren't processed in the brain, and they are not something which we can consciously control. This is because reflex responses are built into us to have a natural protective function. The nerve pathway for a reflex reaction is very similar to that of the nerve pathway for a regular reaction, except in a reflex reaction, the electrical impulse does not travel to the brain immediately. They are similar in that they both involve the receptor transmitting the electrical impulse to the sensory neurons and then getting transmitted to the interneurons. However, in a reflex response, the electrical impulse does not get transmitted to interneurons in the brain. Instead, it gets transmitted straight to a motor neuron to bring about the reaction. This makes the nerve pathway a lot shorter and allows for a faster response. Let me give you an example of this. Let's say that I put my hand on a hot surface. The receptors in my hands will send an impulse to the sensory neurons in my arm, which will then transmit that into the interneurons in my spine. But instead of that electrical impulse getting sent directly to my brain, that impulse is going to be sent to a motor neuron in my arm, which causes it to jerk away from the hot surface. It is only when I begin to jerk my hand away from the hot surface that the electrical impulse is then sent to my brain for it to process what has just happened. So before we wrap up this video, I want to talk you through one particular detail about the nerve pathways. See, in the diagram when all the neurons are connected to each other, they are not actually touching each other in real life. In fact, there is a very small gap that exists between neurons. This gap is called the synaptic cleft. These synaptic clefts exist in order to regulate the amount of electrical impulses being transferred between neurons. If they weren't there, your body would overload with all the messages your brain is getting. So how does the electrical impulse travel between neurons when the synaptic cleft is there? Well, it's because of these chemicals called neurotransmitters. When the electrical impulse reaches the end of the neuron, that neuron is then triggered to release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. When the neurotransmitters reach the neuron on the other side of the synaptic cleft, the neurotransmitters bind to receptors on that neuron, causing it to open up the ion channels. Once these ion channels are open, the electrical impulse from the previous neuron is able to move on to the next neuron. Once the electrical impulse has moved across the synaptic cleft and into the next neuron, the neurotransmitters released can be broken down through enzymes in the body. There are several different neurotransmitters in your body which are responsible for your survival, such as dopamine and serotonin. It is important that these neurotransmitters are regulated in your body and that you don't have any more or less than you should. And there you have it. Now you know the basics of the nervous system and how nerve pathways work. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something really cool in it, then why don't you consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you're notified on any new videos that are released. Give this video a like and comment below on what topic you would like me to cover next. Also, why don't you head over to the Sigma Student Instagram page where we post videos on study tips and updates on new videos. Thank you so much for watching my video, and this is Nigel signing off.